Okay, so in this session, we're going to talk about some strategies for shifting students' focus from trying to maximize their grades to a shift to focusing on learning. Ken Bain, back in his book, What the Best College Teachers Do, argued there were three categories of learners. One was strategic learners who would do just enough work to get the grade that they wanted, but would focus primarily on the grade, which is the type of thing we'd like to see people shift away from. There's also service learners who are just basically interested in getting enough to get by, to get that minimum grade they need to be able to pass. Sometimes students in this category will say things like C's will get degrees. Um, and then there's also deep learners, and those are people who are more intrinsically interested in learning. And of course, people can fit into each of these categories depending on their interests or motivation, the courses they happen to be in. But what we'd really like to see is as many students as possible shifting into that category of deep learners who are motivated a bit more by learning rather than just trying to either do the minimum to get by, or rather than just focusing on getting that grade without caring as much perhaps about what skills they're developing. And, I think unfortunately, a large share of our students fall into those first two categories. And that's probably true pretty much everywhere. I think since COVID, though, it's probably become a little bit worse, at least. Okay. So one issue is with the No Child Left Behind Act a while back, school systems were encouraged to, K through 12 school systems were encouraged basically to focus their efforts on meeting standardized test scores. And standardized testing became a much larger component of K through 12 education. And one of the things that happened with the No Child Left Behind Act and its successors is that school districts that didn't do very well would have cuts in their funding. So the administrators there would put quite a bit of effort into trying to encourage that teachers in the schools focus on those tests, and teachers' pay was often tied to the performance of their students. And the focus on standardized testing in some ways was designed to improve things by making sure that all students met some minimum levels of learning. But on the other hand, the types of questions that we're asking didn't necessarily encourage deeper reflection because they were primarily short answer, multiple choice, fill in the blank type things, and were not the types of higher level learning that we'd like to see students become engaged with. And pretty much as long as we've had a system of grading, students have been conditioned, especially after they get to about third grade or so, to focus their efforts on grades because they're told that this is what's important. This is what will get them into college. This is what will determine what type of jobs they'll have. This is what's going to be important if they want to go on to grad school or medical school or law school or something similar. And one of the things that certainly made things a bit more challenging is that AI provides a convenient and easy way of getting higher grades without necessarily putting very much effort into learning. Now, AI can be used very effectively to increase learning. Unfortunately, that's not how it's most often used by students. So, think a little bit about how grades might affect student interest in the subject and motivation. One of the things that often comes up is a distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And both have some value and both are useful, but grades tend to provide primarily extrinsic motivation, unless you're one of those students who just really enjoys getting high grades for the sake of the high grades. Um, and again, I think we often see this, that students tend to put more of their emphasis on getting that grade. When students come in and talk about a test, or one of the things I do at the beginning of the class in many of my classes, especially in introductory classes, is I do a survey where I ask students about their interest, why they're taking the course, and other related things, try to get a feel for the mix of students in the class. But I also ask them what are their goals for the class. And typically 75 to 85% of the students will say their goal is to get an A or to get a high grade so that they can satisfy the requirements. Most students are taking it as a requirement for either a gen ed requirement or a requirement for the major, but they don't necessarily see it as being that essential for their educational development. And certainly there, much of the focuses tend to be on grades. And we talk a little bit about that. And I try to shift their focus even from the beginning by asking them, why are why are they taking the by asking them why are they taking the course, and most students will say, well, they're taking it because they're required to. And then my next question is, why are you required to? Who is requiring you to do this? And then they said, well, either it's a gen ed requirement, more of them are doing it because they're business majors or HPW majors, and an introductory economics course is required for those. So I'll then say, well, why do you think people in these disciplines thought that this was important for you in terms of your progress within the majors? Just try to get them to think about how maybe some of the things they might be learning, some of the skills, some of the methods of reasoning and types of analysis might actually be useful for them as they move into future careers or future education. And, trying to set the stage to get them to focus a bit more on learning. But again, students have also been conditioned to engage in practices that are not necessarily helpful in increasing learning. Um, there's quite a bit of metacognitive illusion in terms of students misunderstanding what is really effective in increasing learning. What we do see is that students do a lot of cramming when they're studying. They tend to read the same materials over and over again, and they engage in block practice. I reverse the order a little bit there. Where block practice is you keep going over the same thing until you master it, then you move on to the next topic. And what research shows is that none of these strategies are effective for long-term learning. They are fairly effective, though, in providing short-term recall to be able to do well on a test. And if we have high-stakes exams, as many classes do, and we're seeing more of those come back in response to AI in face-to-face instruction, at least. What's happening is that students are encouraged basically by the incentive structures we provide in our courses to engage in things that give them high grades, but do not necessarily increase long-term recall, because we know that long-term recall is enhanced by retrieval practice, by space practice, by interleave practice, spreading it, studying over time and mixing it in with mixing the concepts up together as they study. And that does not pay off immediately in terms of higher grades, but it does pay off in terms of increased learning. And that's a bit of a problem. And we don't generally teach students very much about how they can learn more effectively. And our incentive system does not encourage them to spend time doing these practices because pretty much for most of the students, they've never even heard of these things. Another point that's often made by advocates of alternative grading systems is that feedback is essential for learning, but grades are not. That in order for students to develop skills, they need not just to keep practicing things, but getting some feedback on what they're doing. And that's been shown in many disciplines, sports, and other things. But the grades are not necessarily essential, but getting feedback and helpful that can be used to improve your abilities is important for learning. And one of the things noted by people who advocate alternative grading structures is that from a historical standpoint, grades are a relatively recent phenomenon. In the US, or pretty much worldwide, I believe, the 100-point grading scale that we use so often was adopted first in math and philosophy at Harvard in 1837. Yale introduced a 4.0 scale in 1813, and from Harvard and Yale, those two approaches spread and became used everywhere. Before that, grades were not really used. Students were passed based on how they were doing in a more holistic sense, but they were not receiving grades. Now, Clark and Talbert, in their book, the in their book, the title of which escapes me, and I'll see it again later and recall it. But they have a book on alternative grading, and they're both mathematicians who were both at Grand Valley University, although Robert Talbert just got another job. He's moving to be a director of a teaching center. That was posted just this morning. But the four pillars of equitable grading that they talk about in the book is called Grading for Growth. One is that we need to provide students with clearly defined standards of what constitutes mastery in a given discipline. What is it we expect students to be able to do? Another thing is that if we're using some type of a grading system, not only should it provide clear standards on what the grades represent, it should also be combined with some form of helpful feedback that can help students improve. And also marks, a term used more in Europe than in the US, but marks or any grades that are received should indicate progress. So higher scores should indicate that students have progressed in their learning. And the fourth principle that they use, and this is one that often is a barrier, is that there should be some reassessment without penalty, that students should be able to make mistakes, learn from the mistakes, and then try again. And obviously, there's some limits to that based up on our time and such things. But the more chances we give students to learn from their mistakes, the more students will be successful. And so those are four basic principles. And they also suggest, and they have a description in their book of many grading systems, some of which are fairly simple, others are fairly complex. Now, there's a few things we can also do to try to get students to shift their focus from, besides changing perhaps the way we grade, we could also perhaps try to get students to remember that there are some skills they're developing. And I mentioned that even reminding them that at the beginning of the course can be helpful. But reminding students regularly of the skills that they're developing, using things like the TILT framework could be helpful in doing that, where the purpose of the assignments are explicitly noted. And we've talked about that in a lot of workshops the last couple of weeks. Using low stakes assessments where the cost of a mistake is low can be really helpful. Providing students with regular feedback and then allowing repeated attempts to, again, to attain mastery within the constraints that this does take more of our time typically. And again, I mentioned the tilt approach where we become very explicit about what types of skills the assignments are developing, among other things. Another thing we can do is when possible, and I know a number of other departments on campus have been doing this, is explicitly building some of the NACE competencies into our course learning objectives. And the NACE competencies are ones that are based on surveys of employer in terms of what types of skills students should have when they graduate. And there's often a disconnect between employers' perception of the skills that students should have and the skills that are demonstrated by students. But, we do develop most of these skills because the skills involve things like teamwork. They involve effective communication. They involve being able to work in diverse environments and such things. And all those are things that we attempt to do in our classes, but we don't always make that explicit. And by explicitly mentioning that some of the things we'll be doing in class will be in our classes will be improving their teamwork skills, that they'll be improving their ability to communicate clearly. And all those other things in innate competencies are basically things built into a liberal arts education, but they're not always obvious. They're sort of there implicitly. Making them more explicit can, again, make it clear to students that these are skills that your employers, your potential employers are going to want, and these are skills that you're developing in this class can, again, encourage students to work on developing the skills rather than just trying to outsource the product to AI tools, which is unfortunately still all too common. Another thing that can be really helpful, and this taps into intrinsic motivation, is give students a bit more autonomy in the class. We all tend to respond better when we have some freedom in terms of what we do and how we do it. When we're dictated to by employers or by instructors, it seems less meaningful than if we have some say over how we achieve objectives. And there's a lot of research suggesting that when people are doing things that they find valuable or using approaches that they find valuable, they spend much more time engaged in tasks. So To the extent to which we can give students more autonomy, the more likely it is that students will recognize that the work they're doing has value. Using authentic assessments where students can see that the types of skills they're using in the class actually have some value outside of the classroom. That again increases motivation and puts more of a focus on acquiring those skills and developing those skills. And when possible, even co-creating the syllabus can be helpful, where students, you share with students the learning objectives that are built into our courses, and then ask them how would they like to be able to demonstrate that? What would be engaging and interesting ways of doing that? And that can often come up with a way that, or strategies that students buy into, and they buy into it much more when they had a say in creating how that's done. And if you're giving them assignments, give them more flexibility, again, when feasible, over how they're going to demonstrate their learning, which is very consistent with, well, either in an approach called autonomy supportive teaching or just with general UDL principles. Now, some ways of doing this that don't work as well now as they used to. Mastery learning approaches have been used for decades. And basically, with a mastery learning approach, students are given a limited or an unlimited number of opportunities to demonstrate their learning, and only the highest grade they achieve is recorded. In my intro course in economics, I had put together like 4,000 or 5,000 questions subdivided by topics, including a lot of algorithmically generated questions, so that students could take the same quizzes on specific topics over and over again until they demonstrated mastery. But what happens now is they tend to do that on the first attempt because, again, they have AI tools or built into their browser plugins that will tell them the answers, or they can use their phone, take a picture of it, of the screen, and get the answers right there. But this can be really effective if you can have students do this, because in a strategy like this, if you have the questions already generated, it's really easy to implement with just random selections from question pools. And then you could build more elaborate tests that involve some interleave practice where you mix things together by just drawing from a certain number of questions from each of those pools up until that point in the class and randomly selecting from those. And that used to work really well. It doesn't work quite as well now because it's really easy to outsource that to AI. Um, it's easiest to do that type of thing in STEM fields where algorithmic questions can be used without requiring as much work generating those questions. It doesn't work quite as well in classes where each iteration of student work has to be graded by the instructor. Although if you can build in some peer feedback, that can assist. Or if you build AI into the process and you have students submit their original drafts, the way in which they use AI or the history of how they've engaged with AI, that can also be helpful. Adaptive learning platforms have been shown in many, many studies to be effective in increasing learning, and many of them are available at very low cost because many of them are based on simple engines, many of which are AI engines that have been out there for a while. But they're using content from OER materials, so you don't have the same textbook cost. It's mostly the cost of maintaining the adaptive learning system. And we do have some adaptive learning platforms available for free from SUNY, which are those that come out of the Carnegie Mellon project. But we also have in the license SUNY has with Lumen Learning, there are also the Waymaker packages, which are not quite adaptive learning. They refer to them as personalized learning, but students have unlimited attempts to demonstrate mastery. But with an adaptive learning platform, the path of the student is determined by how they did on previous questions. So if students are getting a lot of questions wrong, it drops them down to a lower level, helps them build up to a higher level of understanding. With a personalized learning system, you just work through each of the course modules until you master it. And it's giving you a visual indication of which learning objectives you satisfied, where it turns from these indicators on the boxes for each of the module, each of the subtopics in the module will display display a check mark or turn green once they've demonstrated mastery. Um, so, that's not quite adaptive learning, but it's close to it, but it puts more of the onus on students to work through to master those concepts. And you can give them a score, perhaps it could be really low stakes, based on how many subjects they've mastered or subtopics they've mastered within the module, or only give them, credit if they've mastered all of them. But again, that is vulnerable to AI, as is true for pretty much all non-proctored work. The benefits, though, is students can focus their efforts where they need the most work, and it builds in retrieval practice. So the students who need the most practice are automatically getting more practice. And many of the adaptive learning platforms also bring in some interleave practice and some space practice, in that as you move further into the course, there will be random selections of concepts or content drawn from earlier portions of the course. So that way it's building in evidence-based practices. The Psych-Learn package, which was put together by the American Psychological Association, based on some of the research and work that they've done, working with one of the adaptive learning vendors, is a really nice example of that, because it does build in some effective learning approaches, but all of them pretty much do as well. And they tend to be underutilized. I think they're underutilized. Another strategy, and this was suggested by Linda Nielsen, is specifications grading. And what happens here is, instead of focusing on whether someone got a 78 or an 82 or an 85 or an 86 on a given assignment, basically you construct, for each module of the course or throughout the course, you come up with specifications which align with the course learning objectives, and students have to demonstrate them as they move through the course. And basically every assignment is graded as a pass fail, so students no longer focus on whether they get an A minus or a B plus or whatever. The question is, have they demonstrated mastery of this concept? And what Linda Nielsen suggests is that you provide really clearly detailed or clear rubrics for each assignment, again, with some exemplars. And basically, if students get the equivalent of a B or better on the work that they submit, that demonstrates mastery. And that's done basically throughout the course. And you allow multiple attempts. Sometimes people only allow one attempt or two attempts, or there may be a limitation on the number of topics you can reattempt. Most people will allow at least a second attempt. Some people will allow more. And then what happens is, at the end of the course, the grades are determined either by the number of specifications that the students have completed at a satisfactory level. So if they've completed maybe 95% of them, or maybe all of them, they get an A. If they completed 75% of them, they might get a C, or between 65 and 70%, they might get a C minus, whatever. You can just basically either align grades with the number of specifications that have been completed, or you could have different specifications for grades of A, B, C, D, and F, or in our case, at Oswego, in E. So you could have one set of standards, which becomes closer to contract grading, to get an A in the course. You could have another if a student is happy with a B in the course because it's not relevant to their major, but they'd like to do reasonably well in it. You could give them different requirements for each of the learning modules. So those are the two approaches she suggested. She generally recommends having basically the grade determined by the number of specifications you've completed. Contract grading is another one, in which there is some type of a contract drawn up between the instructor and the students, which could be either predetermined by the instructor, or it could be through a mutual agreement where there's often some discussion. It could be tied to the number of allowed absences, the number of drafts, papers, assignments completed in a satisfactory manner, the number of reading responses, etc. And what happens with this type of approach is used most often in humanities courses, It's very common in writing classes. It takes some of the anxiety away from students when they submit things, but you do have some minimum standards so that if you set a limit on the number of papers, there may be a certain minimum word count, there may be certain minimum standards that have to be met in each of those. But it can take some of the pressure off and reduce the amount of anxiety. Labor-based grading, again, is basically students are graded based on how much labor they do, which in most tends not to go over very well in certainly the STEM fields or in many fields for that matter. But it is part of how we evaluate people who are learning to become plumbers or electricians, and so forth, or people who engage in internships. Part of the process is just spending the time interacting in the field or in that area. So that is sometimes used, and it's again really common in introductory writing classes, but some other humanities courses as well. A more extreme form and is basically to shift entirely away from grades, and that approach is called ungrading. And the goal of this is that the student faculty focus is entirely on the learning. Students do not receive grades except when the instructor is forced to provide grades at the midterm and the final in the course. And so the way it works basically is you specify clear learning objectives, you give students assignments as you normally do, but throughout the course, students are reflecting on their learning. So part of an ungrading approach is building in this metacognitive component where students reflect on what they learned, how well they learned it, what's working well for them, what's not working well. And this is sometimes done by having a journal that's shared with the instructor. Sometimes it's done with publicly or posted or class blogs where the instructor can follow their progress and give them feedback. But throughout all this, the instructors are giving them regular feedback. And one of the arguments for this is that there have been a lot of studies that when students receive grades and feedback versus feedback alone, they are much more likely to implement the feedback when it's not accompanied with a grade. Because when the grade is there, if the grade is high, they often will stop and will not implement any feedback. If the grade is low, they often will get discouraged and stop working. But feedback alone has been shown to result in increased effort, increased corrections, increased changes and revisions and so forth in written work and in projects in general. And that can be a really useful incentive. The way in which midterm grades and final grades are determined is through some type of consultation between instructors and students. Typically, what happens is students are given a rubric to evaluate their work or a set of criteria, and students provide a written reflection to that. And then they submit a recommended grade. And often that's done with the Google form that dumps it into a spreadsheet that the instructor could then see. And then the instructors meet at the midterm and at the end of the grade and mutually agree to a grade. Now, I have not done this myself, but everyone I've talked to who has done that, including some faculty here, have said that it's worked very well for them because students stop fretting about, whether they've got an 87 or a 65 or something else on individual assignments. Their focus is directed just at implementing feedback and making improvements and focusing just on their learning progress. And the concern many people have with an ungrading approach is that, well, I think I've mentioned this here. One concern is the Dunning-Kruger effect, that the students who understand, Dunning-Kruger was a faculty member, well, is still a faculty member and a former graduate student at Cornell in psychology. And the Dunning-Kruger effect is when you have people who have the least knowledge of a subject believe that they have the deepest understanding. We may see that sometimes in politics, for example. But in any case, what happens is one concern is that students may not really understand how well they're doing. And the other concern that's sometimes there is at the other end is there may be stereotype threat. If people are subject to stereotype threat, they might perhaps underestimate the quality of the work. And when I've talked to people, we've talked to a number of people doing this on the podcast, they generally say that the first effect is really kind of rare. That in a class of 25 to 50 students, they may have one or two students who is clearly overestimating the quality of the work that they did. But they say that whenever they have that conversation with a student, they say, well, you missed a third of the classes, you didn't turn in these assignments. How are you going to justify getting a grade of an A when you've really only done 60 or 70% of the coursework? And faculty say they generally back down immediately and say, well, I was just kind of hoping for this sort of miracle. But they tend to agree that a lower grade is warranted after just a little bit of nudging. What they say is far more common is stereotype threat, that female students and students from historically minoritized groups are more likely to underestimate the quality of the work that they've done. And they say that they usually have to spend more time reminding them of just how high quality the work was that they completed. And again, everyone I've talked to who has done this have reported that, and it's been probably a couple dozen people now. So at some point, I may try it, but I haven't yet. I think it's probably the economist in me who tends to, like to measure things regularly and et cetera. But in any case, there's also some information here, and I'll share this with you. This has a link to some resources, and this may be perhaps the most useful part of this session because I think you've heard many of these things before. But if you grab that or scan that code, what will happen is we'll take you just to a little research that contains a little bit of background information. There's what the best college teachers do. He died. Ken Bain died in this past year, but he had done some interesting work, and he actually came here in 2005 and gave a really nice talk and all day webinar or workshop. Here's some information on alternative assessments. This was created by a SUNY Fact 2 group on alternative assessments that went for a couple of years actually, and they have a 4-part webinar series, and links to the recordings are there about alternative grading systems. There's a link to, information about the grading for growth, including a podcast we did with David Clark and Robert Talbert. Josh Eiler's most recent book on this is Failing Our Future. He was at SUNY CIT last year and gave a talk related to this. And there's those other books there, which are really good. Mastery Learning, here's an Ed Surge podcast on that. Here's some of the resources from Linda Nielsen. Actually, I meant to update this. There is a new edition of this that came out last fall or last winter, but the same arguments basically apply. And we did do an interview with Linda on specifications grading, as well as a few other interviews with her. Here's some more information on contract and labor-based grading, and here's some information on ungrading. And there's also a couple of blog posts there, blogs. Emily Pitts Donahoe works with Josh Eiler at the University of Mississippi Teaching Center. And one of the things she talked about on her blog, one of the things she blogged was each week she talked about her journey to an ungrading approach. She was doing that all through the semester, but she didn't publish it until the semester was done because she didn't want to be posting about current students while they were in her class. She didn't want them to be going back and forth looking at her reflections until after it was all over. But it was a really positive experience, and she's got a book coming out on that along with several other people. I don't remember her 2 co-authors. But we'll be interviewing them sometime in the fall. The book is coming out in probably 2027. And we did do a reading group on grading for growth, and Maggie Smool, who is the associate director of the teaching center here, who's been on leave for much of the last 3 or 4 years. She's had 3 children, and she's been on family leave and sabbatical leave and other things, but she will be coming back this fall. But we wrote about our experiences or some of the things that came out from the discussions in the Grading for Growth reading book in the fall of about 2 years ago, I guess it was. But it's a really good book. So that's all I've got. So, and I've been talking a lot because I know you had to go. But any thoughts or questions?
I guess one question that I have is really focusing on the motivation side. Um, are there what strategies can be implemented aside from maybe the grading side of things to improve motivation?
I think the main thing is reminding students or having students reflect on the skills that they might be developing. You know, if we can get students to reflect on why we're doing things. One great example I saw of this was we had a former provost who stepped down as provost and was teaching a course in the COIL program where students here worked with students, I think it was in Lebanon actually, and she invited me to the class because they were going to be reflecting on their experiences working with it. And they started the discussion by the students were complaining that the people on the other side, their partners, didn't always do their share of the work. Had trouble sometimes completing the work, and they were disappointed in the amount of work that they did, and they didn't think the whole thing worked all that well. It would have been easier if they were just working with people from their class. And then she just paused for a second and said, well, I want you to think a little bit about what types of skills that you might have gotten by doing this. And it just changed the whole atmosphere in the class because then they started talking about, the fact that they learned how to work with people from other cultures. They learned how to work with people This was a bit newer back then. It was about 8 or 9 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. They learned how to work over time zones and over language barriers and such things. And it was a very different discussion just by reframing it, by getting them to reflect on the skills that they were developing. And the more we can convince students that what we're asking them to do are skill or to develop skills that they find valuable, and if they can recognize those skills, they're going to be much more intrinsically motivated. Or at least that's the argument. And there is some evidence for it. It's not easy to do, and it's especially difficult to do in gen ed courses that students may be taking just to get through that one aspect of their program that they don't value as much, but they're doing it because it's a hoop they have to jump through. But if you can show them that they're still developing useful skills, that can help, I think.
Thanks. And one other question I had was just about the NACE competencies, since I'm not too familiar with those. I'm wondering how often those are updated and whether they've changed at all since kind
They
of
have.
AI
They
has
they
hit the
do
scene.
they do regular updates, and we can find them. They expanded them about a year or so ago. So if we here we go. It's their competencies for a career ready workforce. So this is a 2024 version. I don't know how often they revise them, but I know they were revised after this. But it's based on employer surveys, and then they just group them together. And let's see what the most recent one are. Um, it's an ongoing process, but I don't think let me qualify that. I've seen at least two revisions since I've been let me, one more time, clarifying this. I have seen two sets of NACE competencies in the last 3 years. I don't know how often they're changed, but I do know that they do regular surveys of employers, and they use those to help shape the competencies, and they do report on them. Like here's validity of the NACE competency assessment tools and so forth. Um, and there we go. So this is looking at how many colleges and universities are implementing career readiness competencies on their campuses. And more institutions are doing that. In SUNY, I know Oneonta and Buffalo have been two that have done it the most, but we're doing it more and more. I know the chemistry department had done it fairly extensively a year or two ago, a year and a half or so ago. And I know my department is working on trying to embed more of those. But they are updated. I can't say for sure how often. but I'm pretty sure the surveys are done every year, and I suspect they probably adjusting them at least as they see changes in the survey data, which may not be every year, but it's probably a reasonably quick turnaround. But on the other hand, I don't think those things have changed all that much. Although with AI, that may very well be changing more in the future.
Yeah, and
So,
that's exactly why I asked, because I'm wondering like to what extent are these things kind of evergreen versus, subject to change as the landscape evolves, and how do we best prepare our students, which is
and
maybe the
I
bigger question.
and I know there has been some talk about AI literacy being embedded in this. I'm not sure if that came out of NASO or just other applications on campuses, but yeah, some of them are pretty much evergreen, like, being able to work in teams and so forth, being able to work in a diverse environment and so forth is something that is probably going to be evergreen. Um, Good communication skills will probably be evergreen, although writing skills may not matter so much with AI now, but certainly presentation skills and so forth. Well, again, some of that may not matter as much given AI tools as well. So yeah, that we probably will be seeing these change quite a bit as that becomes built in more.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you. Good to see you. And again, thanks for sticking around for a somewhat shortened version of this.
All right, take care.
Yep, you too. Have a good week, a good day.
You too.